I had somebody real smart tell me one time that when somebody dies, you don't just grieve the passing of that person, you also grieve the passing of an era. And I feel that with my grandparents. At both of my sets of grandparents' houses, there was this whole vibe, this whole thing, this whole rhythm to life. Stuff smelled a certain way, and a circle of people would gather around. There's a way we did stuff. There's a way life felt. And when they passed away, slowly I came to grips with the fact that that era was over, and it lives on in my parents, and it lives on in us, but it's not the same. This is a new era with dashes of that old era that I miss so much. And I think this is very much true when you're talking about a ruler, especially a king. I mean, for us, in my country, we got presidents. We have 4-year terms. You're only allowed to serve 2 of them. But I think a lot of Americans lump the ages of our era, of our lives, into the era of given presidents. Like, the Clinton years, that's when I was a kid and I was doing this or that. Oh, who could ever forget the Obama years? They were like this. The Trump years felt like that. The Biden years, all of these things, we're going to have associations with those eras, but they come and go really quick in our country. Whereas in the ancient world, the Darian era is quite the era. It's a better part of a lifetime for a lot of people. The Xerxesian era is a very significant era. It's a whole time when things felt a certain way, when the trajectory of the whole empire, and the empire was all of life, was headed in a given direction. And we get a slice of that pie right square out of the middle, more like a fistful of that pie right out of the middle, totally socially inappropriately grabbed and held aloft for all to behold. When we read the book of Esther, we get a really good sense of the Xerxesian era. And we see even the 2 versions of Xerxes that the historians tell us about as well. There's the pre-debacle in Greece Xerxes, and there's the more despondent, disaffected, weaker, more influenceable version of Xerxes after that trip that wrapped up in 480-ish BC. And so it seems appropriate as we get to the end of the book of Esther here to consider what this Xerxesian era is and what its legacy is, what his legacy is, and what we can derive from that, what we can anticipate is going to spill over from this now bygone era as we move into the next era of Ezra and Nehemiah, into the era of Xerxes' son, Artaxerxes. So I guess I already touched on it a little bit. Big picture, young Xerxes seems super swaggery and absolutely bent on getting revenge, squaring accounts for what happened to his dad, Darius, who went to punish those dirty Greeks and lost badly at the Battle of Marathon and had to come limping home. And his whole plan from there on out was, I got to get back over there. I got to finish them off. Now, there are a whole lot of designs that we've talked about, many that we will not talk about or that we haven't, on one side or the other, ultimately defeating and crushing. We're going to go crush the Greeks. We're going to go crush the Persians. Ultimately, it's Alexander the Great who settles the score, and he succeeds in crushing the Persians and then absorbing them. But that's not for another 100 years and change after the time frame that we're looking at. So Xerxes has a familial honor obligation, a lot like the honor obligation that I think Esther and Mordecai were fearful of if they had decided to leave Haman's kids or associates alive. That blood honor obligation to avenge one's father was a super, super real thing back in the day, and Esther took it seriously, and Xerxes took it seriously. See, they're a match made in heaven. No wonder they hit it off as well as they did. They probably just sat around that one night that she had with the king and talked about, what do you do to somebody if they dishonor or threaten your family in some way? And they're just like, we have so much in common. We finish each other's sandwiches. And they were like, yes. And they got married. And it was absolutely amazing. But the Xerxes who comes back had a relational debacle on the trip home. He left behind a trusted general who, the Greeks wiped the floor with him at the Battle of Plataea and effectively chased Xerxes out of Greek territory for the rest of his reign. So there goes his right-hand man, Mardonius, and a key advisor. And also he's having marital problems and things are spiraling in his personal life. Now look, a lot of people look at the whole Greek campaign and they say, well, if you really think about it from a neutral perspective, Xerxes did fine. He won the Battle of Thermopylae. That's where he defeated Leonidas and the 300 Spartans. And he burned Athens and sacked it. I mean, that's pretty good. He lost a fleet and an army and his key general. Sure, but, call it a draw. And Persia was so huge economically and geographically and in terms of population at that point that, were they really even going to miss anything? It was just a big jaunty adventure. Now, some people will point to the very end of Esther chapter 10:1, where it says King Xerxes imposed tribute throughout the empire to its distant shores, not just as an expression of his great power, which is by the transitive property then cast down to cast a bright positive light on Mordecai. But some people will look at that and say, well, that's what he had to do to patch things up economically. He had to tax his empire heavily, and that probably taxed him to make up for what went wrong with the Greek campaign that didn't provide the riches that he had probably hoped it would provide. I don't know for sure which way to read it. Again, some people think that this wasn't a big deal to Xerxes, a fly on the windshield, just who cares? Other people think it changed him permanently, and this is a bad, embarrassing loss for Persia, and that the Achaemenids never really recovered their glory that they had under Darius and Cyrus. I think I kind of tend toward that latter interpretation, or at least I think that's how Xerxes perceived it, as being very humiliating, and as him having failed as the father of the Persian people and as the son of Darius the Great, who really is the establisher of the empire. And I think that just because of how all the sources, including Esther, have him acting after all of that. Weird, broke down, needing lots of advice and help. He was so sure of himself in the early going of his reign that he would just fire a queen in front of everybody for not doing a sexy dance. He would get together tons of people and burn tons of money. He knew what to do, but he doesn't know what to do in the rest of the book at all. He's super wishy-washy as things go along, and that squares with the extra biblical accounts that we get of him as well. However, I think a very fair reading of Xerxes' legacy is that he did okay on that Greek campaign. It wasn't an absolute disaster. I know I sometimes use that term, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not like he lost his country over it. He successfully kept his court together for a decent period of time. Eventually that catches up with him, but he managed to keep his household in order. He was able to produce heirs with his wives. I'm not aware of any heir that he produced with Queen Esther, but he had more than enough heirs to have all of them want to compete for the throne when he was gone. And it looks like he was a very competent administrator who was very attentive to what was going on around the empire. I think this probably would have been looked back on as a very bureaucratic era, when doing things by the book and reporting properly was as important as ever. And maybe the same could be said for the reign of Artaxerxes. We'll look at that as we move forward here in a few days or weeks or whatever. It's kind of hard to assess an entire guy, the entire reign, the entire era of somebody as influential as Xerxes in one conversation. So I'm going to split this into two. We're just going to pick up right where we left off and finish considering what this era would have meant in the mind of the original audience. I think that's going to help us read back into Esther better as we close out this season. I also think that's going to set us up for success as we look ahead to stuff that happened in the era of his successor over in the book of Nehemiah, his successor being Artaxerxes. What stuff from the Xerxean era would have been unfashionable in the Artaxerxean era, and what stuff would have carried right over, and how would people have thought of that? So we'll kick this around a little bit more, and like I said, we'll pick up where we left off next time around. All right, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.